Sorry to interrupt your lunch, but this is not just a lunch, it's also a book signing. So we're here to sort of get the ball rolling and to introduce our keynote speaker. But first of all, just welcome to the second half of the second day of the Smart Law for Smart Cities Symposium. My name is Emily Seiderman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Fordham Urban Law Journal. And we at the Journal are very excited to be partnering with a variety of organizations here at Fordham, not just the Urban Law Center, but also the Center on Law and Information Policy, the Urban Studies Center at Fordham University, and also the Center for Digital Transformation. We at the Journal do a symposium every single year, usually around this time, but we've never done anything quite of this magnitude before, so we're all very excited to be partnering with so many people and organizations here at Fordham to make this event a reality. I also just want to put in a quick plug for the book. We're actually publishing a lot of the articles that come out of this symposium this fall, and I encourage you to look forward to that when next year's board publishes that, hopefully sometime in October or November. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Alex Berke, the symposium editor here at the Urban Law Journal, because she did a lot of the logistics and everything for this event, and also her staff members, Amanda Rains, Mary Gibbons, and Dan Kerbelo-Zeidman, and their tireless, unflagging work in making this all happen, so thank you very much. Over the past day and a half, we've heard from academics, practicing lawyers, public officials, journalists, nonprofit world members. We've talked about everything from cyber charter schools to digital free speech. And today we're going to talk about citizen surveillance as well as perspectives from the private industry. But before we get to that, I'd like to bring up Alex, actually, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker and the subject of the book signing. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So hi, everybody. As you heard, my name is Alex Berke, and I'm the symposium editor for the Fordham Urban Law Journal. I've been working on planning this event since about April of last year, so I'm really pleased to see all of you here today. Also so excited that the conversation that's happening is really reaching beyond this building right now. We've had over 83 unique visitors to the live stream in the past day and a half. We also have a very active Twitter feed going on, which you can see and participate in. So it's great that this conversation is really a base to get the ball rolling. So I wanted to thank Emily Seiderman for her support and help planning this event. As she mentioned, it's about 2 times as long as your typical symposium, so it's really benefited from her attention. And Professors Nestor Davidson and Annie Decker, if anyone wanted to open my email data, put in a request, they would have to sift through thousands upon thousands of emails between us arranging this event. But I think it's fair to say that we've closed all the loops and it's a success. I also just wanted to quickly thank Professors Olivier Sylvain, Rosemary Wakeman, Joel Reidenberg, and R.P. Raghupathy for your collective wisdom in pursuing the speakers, sponsors, and attendees. So now it's really my honor to introduce Dr. Anthony Townsend. He's the Senior Research Scientist at NYU's Rudin Center for Transportation Policy and Management. He's also the author of this book, which is over there. Reading this book, Smart Cities, Big Data, Civic Hackers, and the Quest for a New Utopia, has really expanded my mind about what's going on globally in cities today and the challenges and opportunities that technology presents. Many of the topics that are addressed in this book have been brought up over the last day and a half, and some of them bear repeating. Challenging cities to think about broadband when building out other forms of infrastructure, acknowledging that IBM's Smart City initiative is both a powerful tool for cities and a lucrative financial investment for IBM, and a strong focus on placing people first and using technology to empower and serve cities' residents, not just building apps for apps' sake, but working to leverage the power of technology to get residents what they want and need. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Townsend's comments and encourage everyone whose interest is piqued to buy the book afterwards. Thank you.
Well, Thanks, everybody. Thank you to the organizers for having me here. The book got published in October, and I started going on the road. This is kind of a weird setup. I feel like I'm talking to the sandwiches. I started going on the road in late September, and been speaking about the book for about 6 months now, so I'm so sick of speaking about the book. So I'm not going to give you the standard book talk. There are tons of excerpts all over the web. You're more than welcome to look at those, pick up the book. I'm happy to sign it. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, and I hope it works. But basically, I've been all over the world talking about this. New York, went to Barcelona for a week, London, Sao Paulo, and then I just got back from Singapore about 2 weeks ago. And I thought I knew a lot about this topic. I mean, I've been studying it for probably 20 years now, since I was an undergraduate, and I got fascinated with what telecommuting might mean for cities. But I've met hundreds of people in government, in nonprofit world, academics who are putting just incredible technology solutions out into the world, and doing it in such sophisticated ways to really address the problems of a very rapidly urbanizing and rapidly warming world. And they're making their cities safer, they're making them cleaner, making them more efficient and more productive, more fun. And it's a wonderful thing that's happening. And I would love to tell you about it, but I could not resist the urge to tell a lawyer joke today. So here goes. A lawyer, doctor, and a computer engineer driving a car up a curvy, hilly mountain road. And the car speeds around a corner, it slips, smashes through the barrier, and flies down the cliff. And by some miracle of God, all three of them survive. And the doctor jumps up, says, "Is everybody okay? Are there any bones broken?" Everybody's okay. The lawyer jumps up and says, "We got to find out who built that road and sue them. It's defective." And the computer engineer gets up and says, "Hold on, wait just a minute. Don't jump to any conclusions yet. What we need to do is push the car back up the hill and see if this happens again." And it's a great story about the way engineers look at the world as they constantly want to improve it. It's really more of a tech geek joke, but of course the lawyer still bears the brunt of the punchline. But so seriously, the reason I bring that up is I think the value that law and lawyers have in this whole smart city movement is to apply the very keen sense of risk that they develop in the course of their work. And always asking what could go wrong, what are the ways that this could run off the rails. And my first encounter with this was about 12 years ago. I was organizing a community wireless group here in the city called NYC Wireless. And we had done a number of parks, lit up a couple of parks with Wi-Fi. The city brought us in to talk about maybe doing a project together with the city. So I'm sitting in offices with the staff at Do It, the city's IT department, and I was pretty inexperienced. And they start hurling all these questions at me about risks, about things that go wrong. What if the antenna blows off the roof and hits somebody on the sidewalk? And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this is probably the first conversation in the world about someone being impaled by Wi-Fi. But I think it was a pretty serious conversation to have. And if there's anything that I think has characterized this whole global discourse about cities and technology over the last 5 or 6 years, is that almost nobody ever talks about the risks. I mean, a lot of that is because a lot of these conversations were driven by a corporate agenda and driven by a political agenda, and so who wants to talk about the downsides? But I think, and in the course of researching the book, I really started to be almost obsessed with trying to understand the risks of all these smart infrastructure systems. And on the most superficial level, you see it when you see crashed public displays, right? So the Windows blue screen of death, staring at you from something that is supposed to be, enlightening you and providing you with great information services. I get the heebie-jeebies when I go to the airport and the arrivals display is crashed. It has a blue screen of death, because it makes you wonder, if they can't manage something as simple as displaying some text, like what about the autopilot, right? I mean, that's a fantastically complicated system. And so you start to see these things everywhere once you're sort of sensitized to it. In the book, I write about a visit to Calafia Cafe, which is a restaurant in Palo Alto that was founded by Charlie Ayers, who used to be the head chef at Google. And so this is like classic California. You're not just there because the food tastes good or because it's healthy. The food is designed to make you smarter. And so this is actually Steve Jobs' favorite restaurant. So, I'm there with some clients having dinner. I get up to excuse myself and go to the restroom. And, I walk into the restroom, and the little sensor light is blinking from behind some smoked glass. And there's a sign above it. Now, this is the center, this is like the literal center of Silicon Valley. There's something like 500,000 engineers living and working, in a 50-mile radius. Google's, down the corner. Somebody's probably cured cancer at the biotech lab across the street at Stanford. And the sign above the Smart John says, if sensor does not work, use manual flush button. And so, by pressing that button, you're literally flushing away 50 years of advances in computer science. And, this is just a sign to me that we have become so blasé about the shortcomings of these technologies and the ways that they fail. Still sort of in this center of tech culture, that people have basically accepted that it's okay that this stuff doesn't work the way it's supposed to on a daily basis. And then we're just really complacent about the brittleness of what it is that we're building. I went in the course of researching the book up to IBM, to Armonk, to interview Colin Harrison, who is one of the masterminds behind the Smarter Planet strategy. And we were talking about all the benefits and all the fascinating projects that IBM has worked on over the last couple of years. And then we started talking about the risks of smart infrastructure. And Colin turned to me and he's like, I said, aren't you worried that we're building in brittleness by making these systems so efficient that we're undermining resilience? And he turned to me and says, well, society rides a number of tigers. And I thought to myself, what? What society rides a number of tigers? What is he talking about? And he says, electricity, okay? So we basically built electricity into our civilization in a way that you can never take it back out again and maintain the same standard of living. Chemical fertilizer is another one of these tigers. And we'll never be able to get rid of chemical fertilizer because the world's population depends on it to eat. And basically he was saying that sensors and analytics and control systems and all the smart solutions that many different companies and governments are deploying are going to be another one of these things that will build into society and will come to depend on in a way that we'll never be able to go back. And that really raised my eyebrows because electrification, you could argue, is probably what got us started on the road to global warming. Chemical fertilizer is a disaster in so many different dimensions that it's impossible to list them all, even if I had an hour. But of course, they're things that we depend on. They support our modern world, and will be a key part of getting us to 9-10 billion middle-class people by the end of the century. But it struck me as just an incredibly blasé way of coming at it. And so I kind of prioritized this discussion of the risks much more than I had set out to when I wrote the book, and started to collect a lot of this information and basically devoted an entire chapter to it. And it's the second to last chapter, so it's basically the chapter right before I lay out kind of my vision of how we should go about designing smart systems for cities. And it's really intended to be very cautionary note. And it's my Tom Friedman chapter title. So instead of hot, flat, and crowded, it's buggy, brittle, and bugged. Trying to sort of highlight the ways these things could go wrong. So I'll just talk a little bit about the bugs and the brittleness because I don't want to get into the surveillance piece, the bug piece, because it's just, there's too much to talk about now. But the word bug is actually really interesting because it comes from an old Welsh word, boog, which was basically the word for pixie, for a little fairy. And its use in engineering dates to the earliest days of the telegraph. And one of the early technologies of the telegraph that allowed signals to be sent in both directions simultaneously. Sometimes you'd get some stray interference coming down the line, and it would sound kind of weird. Edison actually used this term quite a bit, and you can see it in his correspondence as with some of his collaborators. And smart cities are filled with bugs. Just last week, Uber, the electronic hailing system, went down because of a data center problem in California that was caused by software. So, your taxi system, boom, lights out because of some bad code. Also in San Francisco, 2006, the BART system went down because of a piece of faulty code. And what's worse is that trying to fix the code actually created worse problems that shut the system down several more times over a 72-hour period. Nobody was injured, but the economic impact of this is just enormous. If you look at New York's subway shutdown in 2005 during the strike, 2.5 days, $1 billion economic impact was the estimate. So, that's a pretty big risk that we need to think about. And I think, we're actually kind of really stupid in the way that we build these smart systems. We're building them very quickly. We're not doing enough, I think, risk modeling to understand. And one of the ways I like to think about, what happens when you have a construction boom, when you have a building boom, is what's happened in China over the last 10 years. I mean, just, the most rapid, largest building boom in history, and then you have an earthquake, and all of a sudden you find out that there's tens of thousands of buildings that the contractors forgot to put the rebar into. So you basically have reinforced concrete that's not reinforced. They skimped on the steel. And in China, they call them tofu buildings or tofu architecture, because when they shake, they fall right down. And so I wonder, are some of the smart systems that we're putting out there, are they kind of the tofu building version of an information system? And all you have to do is go back to Y2K to understand how this process plays out and the ripple impacts that it can have. I mean, Y2K was a design shortcut. Someone said, hey, I can save 2 bytes of memory every time I record a date, or 2 bytes of disk space, and so I'm going to take this shortcut. I'm not going to worry about what's going to happen 30 or 40 years down the road, because I'm not being paid to do that. No one's telling me to do that. And the end of the millennium comes around, and worldwide we had to spend $300 billion to reach into all these systems and fix that bug. I think that kind of thing is going to happen again, if not a dozen or hundreds of times. I think the best guess right now, specifically what that liability is what are called forever day bugs. So we've all gotten a crash course in what zero-day exploits are, because the NSA has been collecting them. So these are undocumented vulnerabilities in software that can be exploited by hackers. But once they're exploited, they're discovered and they can be patched. Forever day bugs are bugs that are in products that are no longer actively supported by their manufacturers. Probably this building, there's probably thousands of devices that have forever day bugs in them, because they're little embedded computers that are controlling HVAC systems, they're controlling elevators, they're controlling water pumps in your municipal water plant. And these are often old components, and companies like Siemens and Johnson Controls have phased them out. So they're never going to write patches for that software. CERT, the US CERT has been getting increasingly concerned about this. And I think, as hackers and others who want to do damage figure out where these things are and the vulnerabilities they create, they're going to go after them, and that's been demonstrated. So bugs are a big deal, but I think the brittleness in smart cities is actually something that comes about intentionally. It's a byproduct of intentionally, ruthlessly driving for efficiency, in infrastructure and squeezing out the excess capacity that, if you come at this stuff from a resilience point of view, is actually something that's valuable, because you'll have it in an emergency. And the biggest one that I always come back to here are the cellular networks. These are literally, this is like the nervous system of our civilization. It's our absolute most important communications infrastructure. Don't try to use one during a crisis, because it's not going to work. And this has been proven time and time again. We saw it after 9/11 here in the New York area. There were only something like 10 cell sites destroyed during the 9/11 attack, but somehow the whole region's wireless network was locked up and bogged down. We saw it after the Boston Marathon bombing, where the only way to get a message out of Back Bay, on that day, was to send a text message. And one of my friends, Dennis Crowley, who's the founder of Foursquare, was in the marathon. He told me he spent the whole afternoon after that teaching people over the age of 60 who had never used their text message feature on their phone how to send a text message, because it was the only way they could communicate. And I found that to me, that was just a really kind of depressing state of affairs. And it doesn't even have to be a big disaster. Does anybody remember that tiny little earthquake we had on the East Coast 2 or 3 summers ago, right? every urban metropolitan cell network on the East Coast locked up because people were completely freaked out. They thought it was a terrorist attack. They thought it was a real big earthquake. And anytime you have even the slightest perturbation in a city, these networks basically collapse. And I think the industry has really resisted efforts to beef them up, despite the fact that the quarter before the Boston Marathon bombing was AT&T Wireless's best quarter ever. I mean, they're literally printing money, and somehow can't find enough spare change for some bigger batteries. And my favorite story about brittleness in smart cities actually comes from Israel. And it's about the app Waze, which Google bought last summer for something like $1 billion, crowdsourced traffic reporting app. And the way Waze got people to adopt it was they gave them free turn-by-turn navigation and free traffic information long before a lot of other providers did. And I was in Israel last November, and one of my clients were sitting there over lunch, and he says, it's a really interesting story about smart cities. He said, 2011, sometime in August, there's something like 20% of the drivers in Israel are using Waze on a daily basis. And there's a sudden thunderstorm in northern Virginia. Happens late in the evening, right around a morning rush hour in Tel Aviv. And the wind knocks a tree down in Virginia. The tree falls on a wire, pulls the wire out of a building, which just happens to be Amazon's data center, which Waze is using Amazon Web Services as their backend. And so, there's a thunderstorm in Virginia, and the entire country of Israel, reportedly, I haven't been able to verify the story, goes into instant gridlock because no one knows where they're going or where the traffic is. And this is, to me, this is like a national security issue that somehow a tiny little startup has managed to reprogram the entire transportation system of an entire country. To me, it's just, and no one's aware of that. I don't even think Waze was aware that they had that much influence over how people were behaving. Certainly not the government, certainly not the urban planners. Another example of brittleness in Detroit. Detroit has, I guess the state of Michigan deployed kind of like a smart corridor along part of the I-94 interstate. And it's supposed to have smart lights that can turn themselves off during the day, turn themselves on at night. There's signage, reporting travel times and congestion and whatnot. But everything's going haywire. It's not working like it's supposed to. The lights actually turn themselves on during the day and turn themselves off at night. The signs are going haywire. They're all kind of crazy. And there's been a bunch of investigations and troubleshooting. Does anyone want to guess why this thing isn't working? Anyone? Copper thieves. So people are going in and ripping the wiring for the system out and selling it and buying heroin or whatever they do with it. That's crazy, right? That your smart city can be unplugged by copper thieves. And then I guess the last category of brittleness, this is sort of a bigger category, is what Charles Perrow, the sociologist, calls normal accidents. So these are the kinds of things that happen when a system is so complex and has so many interdependencies that no one really understands how it works, and it has so many unknown modes of failure. And the example that he uses to illustrate this is Chernobyl. And very few people remember that Chernobyl, this chain of events that caused the Chernobyl meltdown, began with the test of a new safety protocol. So actually trying to fix the system sometimes pushes it into instability. So this is kind of a bummer. You guys are looking at me like, wow, this guy's really depressing me. And the reason I bring it up, because if we are going to ride this tiger that Colin Harrison and IBM talks about, we got to know what we're getting ourselves into. And I think that the whole shift that's happening in urban planning from talking just about sustainability to talking about resilience. So yeah, we still want to head off the worst of climate change, but we've also got to prepare for the worst. And if you look at things like what New York City Economic Development Corporation is doing now with the RISE competition, where they're trying to solicit proposals for a resilient technology infrastructure, we're really starting to I think, grapple with what we need to prepare for. If you remember Dr. Strangelove, the character in Dr. Strangelove was loosely based on a futurist, a defense strategist named Herman Kahn, who kind of, he was at RAND, later went on to found the Hudson Institute. He kind of scandalized the defense community in the 50s and 60s, basically by calling into question the whole mutually assured destruction strategy, the idea that no one would start a nuclear war because the other side would nuke you back and we'd all be dead. It would be so horrible that nobody could ever win. It was an unwinnable thing. Well, Kahn, looked at the data and said, no, if we disperse the population and develop advanced warning systems, 70% of the US population and industry could survive. We could win a nuclear war. And that really upset the whole strategic balance. People freaked out. But the title of the book, I love the title of the book. It was called Thinking About the Unthinkable. And he was saying you have to assess the worst case scenario, because in doing so may actually change your analysis of the entire picture. So, to me, like, this is what I was trying to do in this chapter of the book, was to think about the unthinkable of smart cities. And I came up with 5 scenarios where smart cities basically drive us to the end of civilization. And I'm not gonna depress you anymore. But if you want to see those, take a look at the book. And I think we're really just staking the survival of our civilization. I mean, that's what Harrison was saying. If we're getting on this tiger because we have to, and essentially turning our cities into the architectural equivalent of a fly-by-wire aircraft. Something like the stealth bomber, which no human being can fly. It's inherently unstable aerodynamically, and it needs a bunch of sensors and a computer and a bunch of remote controls to constantly adjust the flight surfaces. And that's basically what we're doing with cities. And if the computer goes offline for a millisecond, the whole thing spins out of control. So I don't know what to do about it. The one concrete idea that I did put forth in the book was that we should take some of the planning tools, some of the risk assessment tools that we use now in cities, and start to incorporate these technological infrastructure elements into it. And the best analog is the environmental impact assessment. So you would never build a big project in a city without thinking through what are the worst things that could happen to the environment very comprehensively. I mean, these things really have slowed down the development process, but created great public benefits. So I don't know, call it a cybersecurity audit, call it whatever you want. But I think when we invest in these big information systems, we really need to comprehensively think through what the long-term and indirect impacts are. So I'll stop there, and I'd love to answer some questions. I'm going to be here signing a book later. But thank you all for your time and for not running screaming out of the room. Thanks. Sure. Anybody have a question? Comment? I'm going to throw something. Yeah, so the question is, does the looming risk of smart infrastructure demand legal changes or regulatory changes? It's not really my area of expertise, but I think if you look at sort of very broadly how we tend to deal with the problems that new science and new technologies cause, it tends to end up in the courts before it ends up before a legislature. Courts tend to not be that great at grappling with complex scientific and technological issues. So I think there's probably a good bit of research that could be done to create a body of knowledge that will be available and a body of expertise that will be available when when a smart city inevitably kills a bunch of people by accident. And either a government or a vendor or some poor sucker ends up getting sued over it, or criminal charges. So there's just so many different systems at play that and they're all being regulated in silos to a degree that it's hard to sort of say one or two things that would fix it all. Yeah, right here.
I was just gonna say, what's your best planning team? So I know, like you say, engineers kind of tend to just rush and try and find a solution for things without thinking. Lawyers are the traditional naysayers who kind of prevent things from getting done, maybe. But what was the most successful planning team you saw?
Yeah, so the question is, what was the most successful planning team, I guess, at a city level around smart technologies? So far, cities are just starting to do kind of comprehensive master planning around this stuff. So in the last year, we've seen London, Dublin, Barcelona, Chicago, all put forth fairly comprehensive either digital roadmaps, or that's what they call it here in New York, technology plans. London's, they just call it Smart London. And Dublin's, I think, actually is probably the most advanced, because what Dublin did was create they call it digital maturity scorecard. and it's got like 6 areas of governance and 5 levels of maturity. And they're basically assessing themselves in progress towards that. And I think like any municipal planning process, they've drawn on expertise from across the board. So yes, there's urban planners, but there's also economic development people. There's private sector people, both business people and technical people. They've had some university advice. So I think you really got to bring in a very broad base of expertise to do it well. Yes, right here.
If this is a question about your remarks that the code produced or the actual products produced are very faulty. So up to this point, the only way we can intervene is through hacking or some other form of subversive activity. So how, as a citizenry or as cities, can we intervene in the process of literally producing the code so that it is simply a better quality and reliable over time and more resilient? Because by the time cities purchase it, it's a bit too late, right?
Right. So the question is how can we basically get more transparency about the actual code that cities are using in the operation of government? This is a big issue. I think this is, we all talk about open data. Still 5 years later, we're still grappling with, wow, it's cool to open up data, right? And thousands of conferences about it. Yeah, just do it, right? I mean, we know it's a good idea. We know how to do it. Let's stop talking about it. What I'm more worried about is as you raised the point, the code that's actually operating on that data and all the other data that we never see and never will see because it can't be shared openly because of concerns. What really caught my attention, I know Gail Brewer was here yesterday, and she's done an amazing job pushing the city to think more progressively about technology and to actually do stuff. But the one major flaw in the open data legislation that went through, I guess 2 years ago now, was that it explicitly exempted code from disclosure. And that really caught my eye because I had just done a whole bunch of research looking back at the history of urban simulation and decision support systems in government. And going back to, Joe Flood wrote a great book a couple years ago about the computer simulation that Rand built for John Lindsay that basically justifies shutting down all these fire stations around the city, and how retarded the model that they built was. Like they assumed that there was no traffic because they couldn't model the traffic effectively. So they just assumed travel speeds are the same any time of day, whether it's the middle of rush hour in Manhattan or the middle of the night in the Bronx. They also assumed that there would always be a fire company available to dispatch from any firehouse, even though in reality, like in the Bronx, they were often out fighting fires all day long, and when a new call would come in, there was no one available. Every time you see a computer model, fed by data, whether it's big or small, being used to support decision-making in government, you find these distortions and you find these misguided assumptions embedded in the code. And so I think, I was toying around with the idea last year of trying to foil some piece of municipal software and see, or look at various sunshine statutes to see if there was a way to get to this stuff. But it's very clear to me that line was put in there by the vendors to protect their software from ever seeing the light of day. And it's something I think people are going to wake up to at some point and say, we got to create legal mechanisms to scrutinize this stuff. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but it's a problem that's as old as the use of computers in government. Anybody else? Great. Well, thank you very much. Great questions.